welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. Today I'm going to be exploring a perhaps slightly lesser known corner of London, Crouch End. It is all a bit cut off from the public transport network, doesn't have a tube station, no longer has an overground railway station, but I do think it has an interesting cluster of historic pubs. I'm going to start a little bit out of what people would normally consider to be Crouch End, up at the north in Hornsey, and then I'm going to head back down to this more central area of Crouch End around the famous clock tower here and see what Crouch End has to offer in terms of historic pubs. Pub number one, the Great Northern Railway Tavern, not far from Hornsey Station. So this is a pub building of 1897, which replaced an earlier pub building. Both a listed building, so we have notes from Historic England, and it's on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors. Both of those sources, and possibly one is copying off the other, I don't know, refer to it as neo-Jacobean, a synonym for Jacobean revival. Possibly one of the key motifs here that makes this Jacobean revival is that arcade, and you can see that at the balustrade level either side of the gable. But that said, the presence of a gable, the fact that it's red brick, it has white stone dressing, it has some detailed brick panelling with kind of floral, etc. motifs. Those all sound like Queen Anne revival, so why exactly it's Jacobean revival rather than Queen Anne revival, I'm not sure. Something I'd particularly like to draw your attention to is this iron grille over this doorway here. I've also seen these described as overdoors. I think the curve of the name of the pub, the Great Northern Railway Tavern, there is in a sort of semicircular demi-lune, I think they're sometimes called. I've seen quite a lot of these around this part of North London, and we'll hopefully see at least one more on today's tour. Doubly interesting here because the factory where this particular one was made was right behind where the pub stands today, and you can actually see that on this 1890s Ordnance Survey map. This is a Fuller's pub today. I'm having a half of Autumn Red. Originally it was split into 3 bar areas, a public bar, a saloon bar, and an off-sales area. The only remnant of the off-sales area today, I think, is a now blocked up exterior door with some lovely engraving in it. I think possibly the public bar and the saloon bar have swapped round based on CAMRA's notes on their pub heritage site. There is a difference to be seen in the style of the bar counter, and we've seen this in pubs before, slightly more hefty and grandiose in what was originally the saloon bar side, and slightly more plain and down to earth in what was originally the public bar side. There's some really nice, impressive mirrored etched glass behind the bar there, and more of that wood carving. Possibly the most striking feature of this pub is a fourth space, I suppose, at the back of the pub, which was originally a music room, and it is slightly reminiscent of some of the billiard rooms we've seen. It has this glorious skylight with plasterwork around it, friezes in a sort of Art Nouveau style. I think the stained glass is possibly newer now, I'm not quite sure, but it does look absolutely splendid, particularly on this grim day when it's grey and miserable outside, but this lovely colourful bright light shines through regardless. There is still a piano at one side of that room, and it has a nice, again I think possibly Art Nouveau style fireplace flanked with a couple of ceramic panels there. Throughout the pub in the interior there's still lots of remnants. I don't know if some of them may have been reinstated at some point of stubs of partitions, so you do get a bit of a sense of that original partitioned layout. There's some beautiful joinery there, some really nicely carved woodwork in those partitions. Some of those at least do look genuinely old to me, and many of them also contain panes of etched glass. It is a very smart looking pub. It's, I think, a really nicely preserved. In places, inevitably some bits lost, but what is remaining today I think is really quite impressive. Let's have a look at the history of the Great Northern Railway Tavern. The construction of the railway after which the pub was named, I think, started in the 1840s, and nearby Hornsey Station, which was one of the earliest southernmost stops on that line, the line from London to York, that opened in 1850. So I believe the pub was probably established in its earliest form sometime around then, and certainly if there had been any other pub on this site prior to that, it wouldn't have had that name, because the corporate entity, the Great Northern Railway, only came into existence in the late 1840s. 1840s. There is a record of the Great Northern Railway Tavern in the London Gazette of 1851, and thanks to the London Wiki site for finding that. In 1871, there is an account in a newspaper of an attempt to murder the landlord at the time, William Scholes, is it, or William Scholes, as part of a robbery. You even get a bit of a glimpse of the interior fittings at that time in a rather gruesome way, because some blood was splattered onto a marble mantelpiece. And that again suggests that the pub was first established in 1851. Slightly confusingly seems to suggest that William Scholes was the first owner of the pub, so perhaps our old friend Henry Rickett had just been running the pub on his behalf. I'm not quite sure what the arrangement was there. Pub number 2, the Queen's. I couldn't find a good place to do the talking to camera bits at the Queen's, sorry about that, so I'm having to do this at home. This is an imposing turn-of-the-century corner building in red brick with stone dressings, which, according to the Historic England listing, are in pale yellow limestone. The corner is exaggerated by this projecting round turret crowned with a cupola. I note Historic England's listing, CAMRA's listing, and even Pevsner all seem to shy away from assigning a label to this architectural style. I feel if the previous pub can be called neo-Jacobean or Jacobean Revival, then why can't this? It has gables, and that arcade motif is carried here along the ground floor over the windows. There are some polished granite pilasters here. Once again, I'm inclined to lean towards Larvikite. However, for once, it's more what lies between the pilasters that I'm impressed by here. First of all, the entrances to this pub are really impressive. That main curved entrance on the corner has more of that ironwork overhead, bearing the name of the pub, and here I'm fairly sure we do have a demi-lune shape nestling in this arch. It is very reminiscent of that ironwork we saw at the first pub, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was also manufactured by Jones and Willis, which is, after all, just up the road from here. Inside that porch, there's a mosaic floor with the initials QH for Queen's Hotel, and an impressive curved inner entrance which is all carved wood and stained glass. The other two entrances are similarly impressive, with more ironwork, more mosaic floors, and more of that beautiful woodwork for the inner entrances. Coming back to what lies between those granite pilasters, secondly we have these arched, almost Diocletian windows filled with what Cherry and Pevsner, in their London Buildings book, describe as the pub's special feature. Delicate floral Art Nouveau stained glass manufactured by a company called Cakebread and Roby. As is always the case, we can appreciate it more from the inside, and it really is delightful. Such bright and beautiful colours. Once again, you wouldn't know sitting inside here on a day like today what bloody miserable weather it was. It still retains most of the original partitions, separating the internal space into a total of 4 areas, and those partitions contain more attractive wood carving and stained glass, albeit 1 or 2 of the doorways through those partitions are more modern additions. There's a large island bar serving all 4 of these spaces, and that has some interesting and varied styles of panelling along it. Above all of that is an elaborate Lincruster ceiling supported by these columns. Over to one side of the pub is an area that's now given over to dining, but this was apparently the saloon bar originally. This would have been the posh bit of the pub. That has a couple of interesting alcoves in it, and the one with the raised floor was originally a small stage for musical performances. The other alcove has a fireplace in it with ceramic tile surrounds, but I'm not sure if they're original. It's a stunning pub interior, and I think it really retains much of the sense of opulence it would have had in its heyday. Let's take a look at the history of the pub. It was built around 1900 by John Cathles Hill, I think it's Cathles Hill, not Cathles Hill, who it seemed acted as both developer and architect here. He financed the building and did the design for it. He also built, perhaps more famously, the Salisbury Hotel in Harringay Green Lanes just a year or 2 prior to this, and there are many stylistic similarities between the 2 pubs. Historic England, etc. cites the date of the building as being between 1899 and 1901, and as far as I can tell, there wasn't a pub on this site prior to this. If you take a look at the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, at this location, there's no PH here for public house. It appears it opened for business in 1902, and this is the earliest newspaper mention I could find for it, announcing the opening of the pub, with, it appears, John Cathles Hill going to be there at the opening. Hill was a prolific builder responsible for over 2,000 houses, including large swathes of Harringay and Crouch End. Given the huge scale of his building endeavours, he eventually started to struggle to get hold of bricks. To solve that problem, he bought a small brickyard and turned it into a serious manufacturing concern, a company which still exists today, the London Brick Company. Today, the pub is operated by a chain called Brunning and Price that I don't think I've encountered before. I believe they operate something like 7 pubs in London currently, but their base is more in the northwest of England. Here is a lineup of what they had to offer on the bar. They have a traditional bitter made for them by St Austell Brewery, so that's what I went for today. Thought that was pretty nice, a good quaffing session bitter. Pub number 3, the King's Head. Once again, the King's Head was a pub where it was difficult to find any quiet space inside to do any talking bits. It's very modernised on the interior today, and there probably isn't much original fabric inside, but I wanted to include this pub on the list because I think it's probably the oldest pub in Crouch End. The current building dates to 1892, and you can see this marked in some of the windows along the first floor. It does get a brief mention in Bridget Cherry and Nicolaus Pevner's work on the buildings of London for its rotund corner turret. Although it's not a nationally listed building, it's on Harringay Council's local heritage list. In that listing, it describes it as a combination of Victorian revivalist styles. I found that kind of amusing given the difficulties I've had in the first 2 pubs of pinning down which particular revival style is. They found a clever way to sidestep that altogether. There are some Dutch gables at the side and that turret at the corner that has a conical roof with a copper-clad cupola. And along the ground floor, more granite Corinthian pilasters. They also note a cast iron street name plaque just under the pub sign on one side. As I said, the interior is all very modernised today, so not really much to say about that. Would say the staff were very friendly, had a nice chat with the lady behind the bar. So I think this is an interesting pub for its history, given that this is likely the oldest pub in Crouch End, and I suspect at some point in history this would have been the only pub in Crouch End. Here's John Rock's map of 1746, which shows that there was a building on this location at that time. You can see it at that sort of southern junction of Crouch End, and given that part of the reason that Crouch End grew up as a settlement was essentially just a crossroads or a junction on some of these more major routes, it seems very likely to me that some earlier incarnation of the King's Head was something like a coaching inn. The local heritage listing from Harringay Council suggests that there has been a pub roughly on this site going back all the way to 1662. The earliest newspaper mention I could find for it was from 1775, at which time there was a robbery at the pub. What I particularly liked when I was digging into the history of this was a pair of photos I found. Sorry, the quality of these isn't great, but it just so happens that they are with a roughly similar viewpoint, and one immediately before that 1892 rebuild. It's dated 1890, and then another just after that 1892 rebuild. I believe it's not dated, but it looks sort of 1890s or possibly early 1900s to me. There aren't any cars for a start, and I tried to recreate something like that view today, but it's difficult with all the traffic, and it was raining as well. Hopefully you get a vague idea of the continuity there. In more recent times, probably one of this pub's biggest claims to fame is the Comedy Club downstairs, which I think is one of the longest, if not the longest running in London. Started in 1981, it's called Downstairs at the King's Head. A whole raft of very familiar names like Eddie Izzard and Mark Lamar apparently had their first tryouts here. It's a Mitchell and Butler's pub today, part of their Castle brand. I think they use that for sort of more historic pubs. Here is a lineup of what they had on the bar. Unfortunately, the Timothy Taylor's landlord was off at this point. I was there at a weird time of day, and I went for some Camden Stout from the Keg Taps instead. I'm anticipating I'll get some feedback in the comments about the Harringay Arms, having omitted that. But as you can perhaps see behind me there, it's currently closed, quite long term. There's a sign up advertising it for sale by the looks of things, so that wasn't an option today. Pub number 4, and it is really tipping it down now. This is more over towards Crouch Hill rather than Crouch End. This is the Robin. Cheers from the Robin. Practically already finished my pint here. This is a porter from Pillars Brewery. I think it's somewhere in East London. Really nice actually. It's got a sort of coffee, chocolatey kind of thing. An absolute bargain here at Robin. I'll put the price down. I think it came in at under £5 for a very well poured, very interesting beer. I like that a lot. Now, this is obviously not a historic pub. It's somewhere that has been converted in relatively recent history. I think it goes back to the 1980s, prior to which this unit was something like a post office and perhaps for a while a greengrocer's, and was actually converted by Wetherspoons, briefly called something like Marla's Bar, and then has been sold on a couple of times until it's come into the hands of Nick, who is a bit of a pub hero of mine. He used to run the Southampton Arms in Kentish Town, and without going into the specifics, I think it's safe to say Nick helped me through some very dark times there at the Southampton Arms. Something of the spirit of the Southampton Arms back in the day has been carried on here, but there's also quite a lot of personal flair and personal taste of Nick, the boss. It's a modern interior. You know, this was never a pub traditionally. It only goes back to the 1980s. It's got an interesting atmosphere inside. It reminds me slightly of jazz cafes in Tokyo almost. It's got a weird sort of eclectic mix of decor. I think a lot of the art here is actually by very local artists. Nice quirky touches like this recreation of a historic mirror, which I assume was at some point made for the pub. Nick had this beautiful mural commissioned that's now at the back near the bar. It's a very quirky kind of eclectic take on a medieval Arthurian kind of scene. Of course, the main draw here is the beer lineup. There's a good number of hand pumps. Is that 5 or 6 there? I went for the porter, as previously noted. On the other side of the bar, there's also an array of keg taps, if that's your kind of thing. Price is incredibly reasonable. I don't know if you can get a sense of the weather here. Pub number 5, the Railway Tavern. Back to the centre of Crouch End once again. Cheers from the Railway Tavern. I'm sat on a very wet bench. So this is a building of 1937, a Charrington's Brewery pub. We have encountered some of those before, and correspondingly likely the work of Sidney Charles Clark, the chief architect for Charrington's Brewery at the time. I don't think we have a definitive attribution, but it's very much in his style, that sort of interwar mock Tudor style. It once again has a local listing from Harringay Council. They describe it as Tudorbethan. Did we talk about Jacobean? Now we have Tudorbethan. Mentioned some of the Charrington's livery on the outside, including that House of Toby logo. CAMRA has it on their list of historic pub interiors. They describe it as neo-Tudor rather than Tudorbethan. I suppose that's another way of saying mock Tudor, or sometimes referred to as Brewer's Tudor. Has a really charming interior from the 1930s, well preserved, with a few eccentric, quirky touches here and there. CAMRA cites that the bar counter in the front bar area is interwar. The bar back fitting there is probably original, but if any of you spend any time reading CAMRA's listings for pub interiors, they often talk about the crisis of lower shelving being lost to fridges. Very noteworthy in that front bar room as we see it today is a bar skittles table, which is also known as Devil Among the Tailors. I haven't seen one of those in a long time, and it's quite a rare thing to see one in a London pub, so that's pretty special. A rear room once again has another one of those interwar bar counters, and possibly the most eye-catching feature here is this copper hooded fireplace. It's a really nice space at the back there, a couple of bits of bench seating either side, so I suppose you could call that an inglenook fireplace with that large copper hood. And that was a bit of a trademark of Sidney Charles Clark. So although this is a 1930s pub, it seems likely there was a pub on this site of the same name going back to at least the 1870s. Here is a newspaper mention I found for it from 1872, and that describes a license transfer as a result of the owner at the time having died. Of course, it seems rather strange today to have a railway tavern in Crouch End. While we were down at Crouch Hill earlier, there is a modern station there on the Overground network, but Crouch End itself does not have any form of rail transport links. But it did back in the day, this old line that connected, I think was it Highgate to Finsbury Park, and there are still remnants of that line that have now been turned into the Parkland Walk. There is still some remnant of the old station of Crouch End. You can see the platforms at least. I don't think any of the station buildings are still there today. A bit beyond the usual remit of a handful, i.e. 5 pubs, the Shaftesbury Tavern, pub number 6. A classic combo of dark and pink polished granite, so that could well be our old friend, the Scandinavian pairing of Larvikite and Swedish coastal. Those columns have gilded Ionic capitals and swags for detailing, which I thought was quite nice. More of this wrought ironwork over the entrances. Yet again, this could possibly be the work of Jones and Willis up the road. And here it's further decorated with sort of gilded flourishes, including what looks a bit like a depiction of the Green Man. There's engraving in the windows, although at least some of this is more modern replacements and possibly even transfers in places, but it is done in quite a nice style. The upper floor is a mixture of red and yellow stock brick, not really much to talk about there. And towards the back of the pub you can see the date of this rebuild, AD 1897. That's on the side facing onto Shaftesbury Road, from which I assume this pub takes its name. I've never been to this pub before, but I thought this was really a bit of a hidden gem, or possibly a rough diamond. I'd heard in one of the earlier pubs that this had a bit of a rough history as a pub. I don't know what it's like today. It didn't seem particularly rough to me. It has an L-shaped bar, and the bar back here is particularly striking. I think that gold paint probably is more recent, but it does make quite a nice effect, and according to CAMRA's historic pub listing, the woodwork underneath is likely original, as is also the bar counter, and it has 2 different styles to the counter front. There are a couple of nice vestibule entrances to the pub, more etched and frosted panels there. Towards the back is a room with a higher ceiling and a skylight, which is all very ornate. Quite often these rooms at the backs of pubs were originally billiard rooms, especially if they have a skylight over the top, but as we saw at the Great Northern Railway Tavern, it could possibly have been something like a music room instead. Quick look at the history of the Shaftesbury Tavern. The earliest record on the London Wiki site is from 1861, and I don't think it goes much further back than that. I think Hornsey Rise started to be laid out around the mid-1800s, and the earliest newspaper mention I could find of it is from 1849. The earliest newspaper mention of the pub is from 1864, so not long after that earliest date that the London Wiki site found. And if we fast forward to the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, you can see the pub both marked with a PH and named the Shaftesbury here on the corner of Hornsey Rise and Shaftesbury Road. It's ran by a pub company called Remarkable Pubs. I went for a half of Timothy Taylor Landlord. Here it is on the lineup. Hopefully I've shown there are some interesting historic pubs here, a little bit under the radar, a little bit of a few hidden gems, diamonds in the rough possibly, whatever you however you want to put that. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.